My name is Gwyneth Lawrence. I am 31 years old. Last Thursday, I sat in a stiff leather chair inside a downtown Franklin law office and watched my parents sign over 7 generations of our family history to my brother. Preston smiled the entire time. My mother patted his wrist like he had just cured a terrible illness. They handed him the deed to a 150-year-old timber frame estate, a property I have spent the last decade maintaining for free while he failed at 3 different startup companies. They did not even leave me a guest bedroom. In their eyes, I was just the spare daughter who worked with her hands. But here is the thing none of them knew as they toasted to their golden boy. They did not know about the piece of cardboard sitting in the cup holder of my work truck. They did not know what happens when the spare daughter scratches off a $1.5 million jackpot and decides to keep her mouth shut. Before I tell you the rest of this story, please let me know your age in the comments and subscribe to Morning Revenge if you believe karma is best served cold. Now let me take you back to that Thursday morning. The mahogany clock on Attorney Caldwell's wall ticked loud enough to rattle my teeth. The air conditioner hummed, struggling against the sweltering Tennessee heat, but the room still felt suffocating. I sat in a wingback chair across from a polished cherry desk. I wore heavy canvas pants and boots, carrying the faint scent of raw cedar and linseed oil. Next to me sat Preston. He wore a crisp linen shirt that had never touched sawdust in its existence. My parents, Richard and Diane, sat flanked like royalty, waiting to crown their heir. My mother adjusted a heavy turquoise ring on her finger. She looked at me with that practiced, artificial smile she uses at charity dinners. She said, "It is just how things are done around here, Gwyneth. A historic property needs a man to anchor it. Preston is going to carry the family legacy forward. You have your restoration business. You are fine on your own. You do not need the burden of the homestead." I stared at the thick stack of paperwork spread across the leather blotter. The homestead was not a burden. It was an Appalachian architectural marvel built by our great-great-grandfather. It held hand-hewn white oak joints and period-accurate slate. I knew the marrow of those walls. Whenever a fierce storm damaged the roof or a winter freeze burst a pipe, my phone rang. Preston never answered his calls during a crisis. His last business venture was a boutique fitness center that folded in 8 months, leaving behind a trail of unpaid vendors. But today, his signature was the only one required to inherit a debt-free fortune. My father picked up an expensive fountain pen. He refused to look me in the eye. He just cleared his throat and muttered that Preston understands the land. The metal nib scratched against the thick legal paper. Each stroke severed my ties to the only home I ever loved. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs, restricting my breath. 30 years of trying to earn a place at their table vanished into thin air. I had always done the right thing. I preserved the wood, I fixed the foundation, and I showed up every single time they needed help. None of it mattered. Preston folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. He offered me a thin, patronizing grin. He told me he would make sure I got an invitation for Thanksgiving dinner. He even added that I could park my work truck around the back near the sheds so it would not block the main driveway. My jaw tightened. Arguing with them only proved their point. Whenever I raised my voice, my mother called me emotional or bitter. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. So I stood up. The brass buckles on my tool belt clinked against the quiet stillness of the room. I looked right at my brother and wished him luck. I told him he was going to need it. An hour later, I sat inside the cab of my idling Silverado outside a gas station on Route 96. The late afternoon sun baked the dashboard. The smell of gasoline mixed with the familiar, earthy scent of reclaimed timber sitting in my truck bed. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I stared out at the rolling green foothills in the distance. Out there, my family was probably pouring expensive champagne to celebrate their golden son taking over the kingdom. I reached into the center console, hoping to find a mint to settle my stomach. Instead, my fingers brushed against a $10 scratch-off ticket I bought with my morning coffee. A mindless habit, just a tiny tax on hope I rarely thought about twice. I pulled a silver quarter from the ashtray and rested the edge of the coin against the cardboard. I scratched the first box. Silver foil flaked away, dusting the dashboard like metallic snow. A matching pair of symbols appeared. I moved to the prize box. I dragged the quarter across the final layer of foil, revealing the hidden text. The print stared back at me in stark, bold ink. $1,500,000. I stopped breathing. The engine vibrated beneath my boots. Outside, a large semi-truck rattled past on the highway, shaking my windshield. I looked from the ticket to the horizon and back again. The numbers did not change. They did not shift, blur, or disappear. The prize was real. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. A sudden, sharp clarity washed over my mind. It chilled the heat of my earlier humiliation. Money is a weapon. Weapons are best kept hidden until the exact moment of the strike. If I walked back into that house and announced my win, my parents would suddenly remember they had a daughter. Preston would ask for an investment in whatever doomed business venture he planned next. They would drain my bank account dry and still treat me like second-class dirt. I folded the ticket carefully and slipped it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, pressing it flat against my chest. I could feel the stiff paper against my skin. It felt like a shield. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen lit up with a text message from Preston. He said he had a contractor coming to look at the West Wing tomorrow morning. He wanted my professional opinion on tearing down a load-bearing wall to make an open-concept kitchen. I stared at the glowing words. The destruction of our heritage was already starting. He was going to ruin a flawless piece of history for a cheap, modern trend. He wanted me to give him free advice on how to butcher the house I was just kicked out of. I put the truck in drive and pulled onto the hot asphalt. I realized in that moment I would not stop him. I would let him tear down the walls. I would let him strip the character from the dining room. I would wait for him to drown in his own financial incompetence, because Preston always ruined everything he touched. And when the bank finally came to collect his debts, I would be there to buy the wreckage. 3 weeks passed before the first blows landed on the homestead. I was driving down the old county road, delivering a heavy load of reclaimed chestnut planks to a client in the valley. The familiar route took me directly past the edge of the Lawrence property. I slowed my truck to a crawl, allowing the engine to idle quietly. A white commercial van sat parked recklessly on the front lawn, crushing the delicate wild hydrangeas my grandmother planted 40 years ago. A local contractor stood on the wraparound porch holding a heavy pneumatic nail gun. I watched him raise a cheap corrugated metal sign and press it directly against one of the original 150-year-old white oak pillars. Those pillars were felled by hand. They were cured for a year and shaped with broad axes by my ancestors. The pneumatic gun hissed and fired, echoing across the quiet hills. He drove 3 thick steel nails straight into the antique timber. My chest tightened, causing a sharp physical ache behind my ribs. I could almost feel the iron piercing the historic wood. The sign read, Preston Lawrence Innovation and Wellness Retreat, in bright neon green lettering. Preston had decided the rich Appalachian heritage of our family was an outdated aesthetic. He planned to transform a pristine 19th century log estate into a flashy, modern sanctuary for wealthy urban tourists. His business proposal likely included installing floor-to-ceiling glass walls, pouring minimalist concrete over the original heart pine floors, and building a commercial juice bar inside the grand parlor. It was a gross misunderstanding of architecture and a profound insult to the generations who kept that roof intact. I parked my truck on the shoulder of the dirt road and watched the contractor tear away a section of the hand-carved porch railing with a rusted crowbar. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. He tossed the irreplaceable antique spindles onto a muddy debris pile next to a portable dumpster. Preservation is not just my chosen occupation. It is my devotion. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to march up that gravel driveway, snatch the crowbar from his careless hands, and fire the entire construction crew on the spot. But I remained seated behind my steering wheel. I forced myself to remember the $1.5 million winning ticket currently secured inside a steel safety deposit box at the downtown bank. I took a deep breath, shifted the truck back into drive, and left the vandalism behind. Later that evening, I sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop open. My apartment was entirely silent, except for the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. As a historic restoration specialist, I routinely pull county property records to verify structural histories, boundary lines, and zoning permits. It was second nature to me. I logged into the public database for Franklin County and typed in the familiar parcel number of the homestead. The digital file loaded slowly onto my screen, glowing in the dim light of the room. My eyes scanned the recent activity logs, scrolling past decades of debt-free ownership. Right below the fresh deed transfer giving Preston full control sat a brand new entry filed just 8 days ago. It was a commercial lien. My brother had not just taken ownership of the estate, he had immediately weaponized it. He walked into a high-risk commercial lending firm and used the unencumbered ancestral land as collateral to fund his doomed startup venture. He borrowed an astronomical sum at a punishing interest rate. My parents, Richard and Diane, had to know about this financial maneuver. They likely stood beside him and co-signed the character references. They enabled his delusions, constantly believing his unearned confidence was the exact same thing as actual business acumen. They handed him 7 generations of hard-earned equity, and he immediately pushed it to the center of the casino table to fund a vanity project. I closed the laptop, allowing the screen to fade to black. The trap was set, and Preston was the one tying the knot around his own neck. All I had to do was maintain my distance and let gravity do the work. The waiting period did not take long. Less than 2 months into the chaotic renovation project, the cash flow evaporated. I knew the money was gone long before anyone in the family uttered a word. I drove past the property on a rainy Tuesday afternoon and noticed the contractor vans were missing. The sprawling front lawn was a tragic graveyard of torn earth and abandoned metal scaffolding. Several pallets of cheap imported drywall sat uncovered in the driveway, soaking up the heavy autumn rain and turning to useless mush. Contractors in our county do not abandon a job site unless their checks bounce. My phone rang 2 days later. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let the device vibrate against the counter 4 times before sliding my finger across the glass screen to answer. Diane did not bother asking how my day was going. She launched straight into her rehearsed routine, projecting an aura of casual inconvenience. She said, "Gwyneth, darling, your brother has run into a tiny scheduling conflict with his builders. The laborers are being terribly unreasonable about their payment timelines, and the current weather is threatening the exposed interiors. We need you to bring your tools over this weekend and secure the west wing." I leaned my hip against the kitchen counter and stared out the window at the passing traffic. She was not asking for a favor. She was issuing a royal decree, assuming I would jump at the chance to serve the golden child. I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping all emotion from my tone. I asked her what my hourly corporate rate would be for this emergency rescue mission. A heavy, pressurized silence stretched across the cellular connection. I could clearly hear her sharp intake of breath. She forced a hollow, condescending laugh and said, "Do not be ridiculous, Gwyneth. This is family. We are talking about protecting the property value of our estate. Preston is under an immense amount of stress managing the grand opening timeline. You need to pitch in and support your brother during a critical phase." My response was cold, measured, and immediate. I told her I do not work for free. I reminded her she explicitly stated in the attorney's office that I was fine on my own and did not need the burden of the homestead. I suggested she tell Preston to sell his imported luxury sports car if he needs to pay his carpenters to finish the roof. The polite southern facade dropped in an instant. Diane unleashed a toxic torrent of venom through the speaker. She called me a bitter, jealous woman. She stated I was harboring deep resentment because I was stuck doing dirty manual labor while Preston possessed true visionary talent. She accused me of trying to actively sabotage the family legacy out of pure, unadulterated spite. She promised me I would end up old and alone with nothing to my name but rusty tools and a bad attitude. I absorbed every single insult without a flinch. Her rage did not inflict pain. It provided immense satisfaction. People only scream that loudly when they realize they have lost control. Her unhinged desperation confirmed everything the public financial records suggested. Preston was drowning in toxic debt. The loan funds were gone, the house was halfway demolished, and the commercial bank was undoubtedly circling the perimeter, preparing to strike. I waited patiently for her to run out of breath. When she finally paused, panting into the receiver, I simply said, "Have a wonderful afternoon, Mother," and pressed the red button to end the call. I walked back to my kitchen table and flipped my laptop open again. I navigated straight to the county financial registry portal. I typed in the estate parcel number and set up automated digital alerts sent directly to my private email. I configured the system to notify me the exact second a notice of default was filed by the lender. I was no longer just a discarded daughter mourning her stolen home. I was a calculating predator, tracking a wounded animal through the digital woods, plotting the exact trajectory of its inevitable collapse. And somewhere inside that half-ruined house, Preston's wife was beginning to ask questions he could not afford to answer. 2 weeks after my mother unleashed her rage over the phone, the crisp autumn winds stripped the remaining leaves from the ancient oak trees surrounding the valley. I found myself walking the overgrown perimeter of the Lawrence property on a damp Tuesday morning. A frightened stray coonhound had wandered onto the rural highway near my workshop, and I followed the animal back toward the old property line. I coaxed the dog toward me with a piece of dried jerky, securing a makeshift rope leash around his neck, just as a sharp, piercing voice shattered the quiet morning air. Camille is Preston's wife. Before she married into our dysfunctional dynamic, she spent 6 years working as a senior financial auditor in Chicago. She possesses a razor-sharp intellect, a meticulous eye for detail, and zero tolerance for incompetence. I crouched low behind a thick row of wild blackberry bushes, keeping the hound quiet. Through the tangled, thorny branches, I watched Camille march down the front steps of the wraparound porch. She gripped a crumpled document tightly in her fist. Preston chased after her, looking frantic and disheveled in his designer clothes. She threw the paper directly at his chest. It fluttered to the damp grass. She yelled that she found the notice shoved deep inside his golf bag, hidden behind a box of spare teas. A second mortgage, hidden debt, unpaid interest penalties. Preston tried to employ his usual smooth-talking defense mechanism. He waved his hands and blamed the rising costs of imported construction materials. He insisted his venture capital investors would send additional funding any day now. Camille did not flinch. She stared at him with chilling clarity. She told him he was bankrupting their future to fund a childish fantasy. She turned her back on him, climbed into her sedan, and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the mud. The golden sun was losing his grip. To capitalize on his impending ruin, I needed impenetrable legal armor. Franklin is a tight-knit community where gossip flows faster than the local river. If I walked into a hometown bank and deposited a 7-figure lottery check, the tellers would text the news to their cousins before their lunch break ended. My parents would know by sunset. I drove 2 hours north to Nashville, leaving the small-town whispers far behind. I entered a towering glass high-rise overlooking the Cumberland River and secured a private meeting with a high-end real estate attorney named Davis. I laid out my objectives clearly and without hesitation. I required a corporate shield to purchase distressed real estate without a single public trace back to my identity. Davis guided me through a complex labyrinth of state privacy laws. We established a blind trust to hold the lottery funds, ensuring the cash was legally insulated. Then we formed Heritage Preservation, LLC. The procedural maneuvers required meticulous attention to detail. Every routing number, every authorized signature, and every tax document was buried under heavy layers of ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The tension during this process was palpable. One leaked document, one careless bank transfer, or one nosy paralegal could expose my newfound wealth and ruin my entire strategy. I spent hours reading over dense legal contracts, making sure my name would never appear on a public registry. By the time I left that glass tower, I was no longer just a discarded timber framer. I was the anonymous executive of a ghost entity, equipped with deep pockets and infinite patience. The opportunity to test my new silent advantage arrived sooner than expected. Preston invited me to a tense Sunday dinner. He framed the invitation as an olive branch, but I knew it was a desperate attempt to maintain appearances and placate our parents. He texted me specific instructions to park my work truck around the back, near the tool sheds, just as he promised in the lawyer's office. I followed his petty rules, parking the Silverado in the shadows and walking up the gravel path to the gutted house. The atmosphere inside the dining room was toxic. The historic walls were stripped bare, exposing yellow fiberglass insulation and tangled electrical wires. The kitchen was non-functional, forcing my mother to serve overpriced catered food on cheap paper plates. Richard and Diane pretended everything was proceeding according to a grand visionary plan. Diane drank 3 glasses of wine and loudly praised the open concept layout, despite the freezing autumn drafts blowing through the unsealed window frames. Preston sweat through his expensive cashmere sweater. His eyes darted nervously around the room, unable to hold a steady gaze. Camille sat directly across from me. Her posture remained rigid. Her sharp features betrayed no outward emotion, but her eyes held a calculating depth. She refused to participate in the hollow praise or laugh at my father's tired jokes. When my mother finally stumbled toward the powder room and my father stepped onto the back porch to smoke a cigar, Camille stood up. She gathered a stack of empty plates and walked toward the makeshift catering station in the darkened hallway. I stood up and followed her, pretending I needed to refill my glass of water. We stood alone in the dim corridor, surrounded by the skeletal remains of my childhood home. The scent of roasted meat mixed awkwardly with the smell of raw drywall dust. Camille did not speak. She reached into the tailored pocket of her blazer and retrieved a tightly folded square of paper. She slid it smoothly under the base of my water glass. She offered me a single, knowing look. It was a silent pact forged between 2 women who were both marginalized and endangered by my brother's towering ego. Camille recognized I was the only person in the family grounded in reality. She knew I respected the truth more than I respected the Lawrence name. I waited until she returned to the table before retrieving the paper. I slipped it into my pocket and finished the agonizing dinner, making polite excuses to leave early. When I finally reached the safety of my truck, I turned on the dome light and unfolded the document. It was a photocopied bank ledger. The rows of black ink detailed a financial hemorrhage of staggering proportions. Maxed out credit lines, unpaid contractor invoices, and soaring interest rates stared back at me. Preston had drained every available cent of equity from the estate. At the very bottom of the page, a bold red stamp indicated a final warning from the primary commercial lender. The numbers were far worse than I ever imagined. The bank was no longer just circling the property. They were preparing a lethal strike. The formal notice of default arrived on a damp Thursday morning. It was delivered by a certified courier who parked his unassuming sedan at the base of the long gravel driveway. Preston had managed to bankrupt 7 generations of careful stewardship in less than a year. The commercial lender was no longer issuing warnings or charging late fees. The grace period had evaporated. The bank demanded the entire remaining balance of the high-risk loan immediately. If the debt was not settled, the ancestral homestead would be seized and sold to the highest bidder on the county courthouse steps. Panic quickly infected the patriarchal dynamic. Richard and Diane had spent their entire adult lives cultivating an image of impenetrable Southern wealth. They were prominent figures in the Franklin Valleys, where old money dictated social hierarchy. A public foreclosure was not just a financial disaster. It was a brand-destroying humiliation. Desperation drove them out of their crumbling, half-gutted house and into the polished lobbies of local community banks. My father wore his best-tailored suits, attempting to project authority. My mother carried her designer handbags, trying to look like a woman simply managing a temporary cash flow hiccup. Their arrogant facade failed to secure a single dollar. Small-town loan officers possess long memories and sharp instincts. The local bankers smiled politely, offered lukewarm coffee, and systematically rejected every single application for a bridge loan. They knew Preston was a toxic liability. They knew the property was half demolished, making it practically worthless as fresh collateral. Richard tried to leverage his country club friendships, begging for private investments over expensive scotch. The men he considered peers suddenly stopped returning his calls. The tight-knit community recognized a sinking ship, and nobody wanted to drown alongside my brother. While my family scrambled through the muddy trenches of their own ruin, I spent my days breathing in the scent of fresh pine and wood glue. I was hired to restore a modest hunting cabin near the state park border. The physical labor kept my mind focused. I spent 8 hours carefully replacing rotted floorboards with solid hickory, ensuring the structure would stand firm for another century. When I finally returned to my small apartment, the sun had already dipped below the Appalachian ridgeline. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the quiet, dark kitchen. I dropped my heavy leather tool belt onto the floorboards. The brass buckles hit the wood with a dull thud. Across the shadowy room, a single red light pulsed in the gloom. It was the indicator beacon on my answering machine, rhythmic and urgent. I walked over to the counter and pressed the playback button. The tape whirred and clicked. My mother's voice filled the empty space. The tone she used was jarring. It lacked the usual condescending edge she reserved for me. Instead, she sounded fragile, weeping softly into the receiver. "Gwyneth, darling," she sobbed, "I need you to call me back the moment you hear this message. We are facing a terrible crisis. The bank is being incredibly cruel to your brother. They do not understand his vision. They are threatening to take the house. Your father is sick with worry, and Preston is falling apart. We need you to come home. We found a private lender willing to grant an extension, but they require an additional guarantor with a steady income history. You have your restoration business. You have clean credit. We need you to co-sign the paperwork. Please, Gwyneth, you must do this to save the family." The message ended with a jagged, mechanical beep. I stood in the dark kitchen, letting the silence wash over me. My mother was a master of psychological extortion. She weaponized tears and feigned maternal affection to manipulate her targets. She genuinely believed she could erase 30 years of neglect by calling me darling and pretending my carpentry business was suddenly a respectable asset. She wanted me to chain my own financial future to Preston's sinking boulder. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I felt a cold, pristine clarity. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my cell phone. I dialed her number and listened to the line ring. Diane answered on the second ring, breathless and eager. "Gwyneth," she gasped. "Oh, thank heavens you received my message. How quickly can you drive over here? I have the guarantor documents sitting on the dining table right now." I kept my voice perfectly level. I stripped every trace of emotion, anger, or sorrow from my words. I delivered my response with the sterile precision of a surgeon operating on a severed limb. "I am not driving over there, Mother," I stated. "I am not signing a single document." Her eager breathing hitched. "But the house, Gwyneth, the bank will take the legacy. You cannot just abandon us." "That is Preston's house," I replied softly. "Ask Preston." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call icon. The line went dead. I did not need to listen to the inevitable explosion to know exactly what was happening on the other side of the valley. The fake tears vanished instantly. Diane was undoubtedly screaming into her silent phone, her face flushed with furious, helpless rage. Her backup plan had shattered. The spare daughter refused to play the martyr. The rejection deepened the toxic delusion infecting the homestead. Rather than packing their belongings and securing a rental apartment, the family chose to believe a bureaucratic miracle would manifest from thin air. Preston convinced my parents that his phantom venture capitalists were simply navigating a temporary wiring delay. He promised them a massive influx of cash would arrive before the auction date. Richard and Diane clung to this fabricated hope. They sat inside a freezing house, wrapped in heavy blankets, while cold autumn winds blew through the unfinished kitchen walls. They lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a rescue ship that did not exist. I refused to wait. I drove back to the towering glass building in Nashville, navigating the crowded interstate with calm focus. I rode the quiet elevator up to the top floor and walked into Attorney Davis' private suite. The heavy oak doors sealed, shutting out the noise of the city. We sat across from each other, reviewing the final auction protocols. Davis handed me a thick dossier detailing the precise rules for the county courthouse bidding process. Franklin required all bidders to present verified proof of funds upon registration. I retrieved a certified cashier's check drawn from the blind trust and slid it across the polished mahogany table. The amount printed on the security paper was more than enough to obliterate any competing offers. Heritage Preservation LLC is fully funded, I told him. Davis inspected the watermark and nodded. We are locked and loaded, Gwyneth. I will attend the auction as your registered proxy. I will bid aggressively and decisively. Your brother and your parents will only see a corporate representative. They will never know you are holding the leash until the deed is officially recorded. I leaned back in the plush leather chair. The legal guillotine was sharpened and hovering directly above Preston's neck. All we had to do was wait for the gavel to drop. The contrast between my calculated preparation and their chaotic denial was striking. They were praying for a sudden shift in the wind, while I was quietly building the storm. The countdown to the foreclosure sale commenced. The public notice was scheduled to be stapled to their front door by the end of the week. But before the sheriff ever drove up that gravel driveway, the pressure inside the gutted house reached a critical breaking point. The Golden Son's fragile marriage was about to fracture. And Camille was not a woman who suffered fools. The sharp, metallic click of a heavy steel drawer sliding shut echoed across the marble floors of the downtown bank vault. Camille turned a brass key, locking away her private safety deposit box. She slipped the small piece of metal deep into the silk-lined pocket of her tailored winter coat. She spent the entire morning systematically severing her financial arteries from a dying patient. She transferred her pristine corporate savings into an impenetrable solo account. She froze the joint credit cards she shared with Preston. She removed her personal tax documents and her birth certificate from their shared filing cabinets. She was a professional auditor, trained in the ruthless logic of Chicago financial districts. She knew exactly how to calculate terminal risk. When she returned to the Lawrence estate that afternoon, the autumn wind was howling through the exposed timber framing. The grand house felt like a hollow, decaying rib cage. The air inside smelled of damp fiberglass insulation and cheap spilled liquor. Preston sat slumped on a plastic cooler in the center of the gutted living room. An amber glass of bourbon rested in his trembling hand. He wore a designer sweater stained with alcohol and dust. Camille ignored his pathetic presence. She walked past him, ascending the grand staircase with brisk, purposeful strides. Her low-heeled boots tapped against the bare pine treads. She entered the primary bedroom and retrieved a single leather overnight bag from the closet floor. She did not waste time packing framed wedding photographs or sentimental trinkets. She packed practical garments designed for survival. Thick wool sweaters, crisp white blouses, and tailored trousers. Preston stumbled into the doorway a few minutes later. He slurred his words, demanding to know where she was going. He waved his empty glass in the air, spilling a few remaining drops onto the exposed floorboards. Camille zipped the leather bag shut. The harsh rasp of the metal zipper ripped through the quiet room. She looked at the man she married and felt nothing but profound exhaustion. She told him she was leaving the property permanently. She stated the venture capital funds were a pathetic myth, and the commercial lender was preparing to seize the estate. She refused to let his ego drag her flawless credit score into a fiery abyss. My mother appeared in the hallway, drawn by the rising voices. Diane wore a heavy cashmere shawl wrapped tightly around her frail shoulders, attempting to ward off the biting chill of the unsealed windows. She clutched a string of pearls at her throat. Her face was pale, with a mixture of fear and indignation. She stepped in front of the bedroom doorway, attempting to block Camille from reaching the stairs. Diane deployed her most potent psychological weapon, the weapon of traditional Southern guilt. She told her daughter-in-law that marriage is a sacred, unconditional bond. She insisted a devoted spouse stands by her husband during challenging seasons. She invoked the outdated concept of wifely duty, claiming a true partner would never abandon family during a moment of temporary financial turbulence. Camille stopped walking. She tightened her grip on the handle of her leather bag. She did not raise her voice to match the hysteria in the room. Instead, she delivered a searing, surgical critique that gutted my mother's lifelong delusion. Camille stated, "You do not understand the definition of partnership, Diane. You did not raise a husband. You raised a parasite. You handed a priceless, debt-free legacy to a mediocre man simply because he was born a son. You ignored every single red flag. You funded his failed fitness center. You bought his imported sports cars, and you convinced him his arrogance was actual talent. You destroyed your own future to coddle a fragile boy. I am a professional financial auditor. I know a catastrophic investment when I see one. I am cutting my losses before your son bankrupts me, too." The brutal honesty paralyzed my mother. Diane gasped, dropping her hand from her pearls. Camille pushed past her mother-in-law. She descended the stairs with measured, steady steps. She walked out the front door and let it swing shut behind her. The heavy oak reverberated through the empty corridors. The last remaining pillar of common sense departed the premises, leaving the Lawrence family to drown in their own making. Inside the freezing parlor, Preston threw his crystal bourbon glass against the brick fireplace. The fragile vessel shattered into 100 glittering shards, raining down onto the hearth. He screamed at the empty driveway. He blamed the ruthless contractors. He blamed the greedy banking executives. He blamed the unforgiving local economy. He blamed his wife for lacking vision. He blamed everyone in the universe except the incompetent man staring back at him in the mirror. He poured another heavy measure of amber liquor into a fresh plastic cup and sank deeper into his miserable self-pity. I watched the entire fracture unfold from the safety of my Silverado. I was parked a quarter-mile down the winding county highway, hidden beneath a thick canopy of weeping willow branches. I held a pair of black utility binoculars to my eyes, focusing the lenses on the end of the gravel driveway. Through the magnified glass, I saw Camille march down the path and load her overnight bag into the trunk of her dark sedan. Her posture remained flawless, despite the emotional wreckage she just escaped. I experienced a fleeting pang of genuine empathy for my sister-in-law. She was a brilliant, analytical woman who fell into a trap baited with Southern charm and old money promises. She deserved far better than a bankrupt boy playing house. I lowered the binoculars, resting them on the steering wheel. I did not honk my horn or wave. Revealing my presence would compromise the anonymous legal trap I meticulously constructed in Nashville. I stayed quiet and let her drive away toward freedom. The departure isolated my parents and my brother. They were now stranded on an island built from their own arrogance. No rational voices remained to puncture their toxic bubble. Richard and Diane spent the weekend frantically calling distant relatives, leaving desperate voicemails that went unanswered. Preston stopped bathing. He spent 3 days sleeping on a stained mattress in the master bedroom, surrounded by empty liquor bottles. They were waiting for a miracle that refused to arrive. Tuesday morning brought the final, fatal blow. The autumn sky was gray and heavy with impending rain. A white county cruiser rolled slowly up the gravel driveway. The tires crunched loudly, breaking the tense morning silence. A uniformed deputy stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt. He did not knock on the door to offer apologies or negotiate terms. He carried a bright, fluorescent orange piece of paper in his left hand and a heavy-duty staple gun in his right. He walked briskly onto the wraparound porch, boots thudding against the wood. The deputy pressed the vibrant document against the carved front door. The sharp metallic thwack of the staple gun echoed across the valley like a gunshot. He drove 3 thick steel staples into the wood, securing the formal notice of public auction. The neon paper fluttered in the cold wind, broadcasting their failure to the entire world. The countdown to their eviction had officially begun. The golden sun was out of time, and the ghost entity known as Heritage Preservation LLC was ready to collect. The morning of the public auction arrived with a bitter frost clinging to the low valleys of Franklin. I parked my Silverado down the street from the county courthouse, keeping a safe distance from the gathering crowd. The heater inside my truck blasted dry, warm air against my frozen work boots. The heavy engine idled with a low, steady rumble. I held my cell phone in my right hand and stared through the windshield. The imposing stone pillars of the legal building loomed against a gray, overcast sky. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, I watched my father and my brother arrive on the plaza. Richard wore a wrinkled, tan trench coat that had seen better decades. Preston kept his hands shoved deep inside his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the biting chill. They walked with a slow, dreadful hesitation. They bypassed the front rows of the audience and positioned themselves at the very back of the crowd near a frozen, decorative fountain. They still clung to a pathetic fantasy. Preston had convinced my father that the gutted, unfinished state of our ancestral house would frighten away any serious investors. They genuinely believed that if no one placed a bid, the commercial lender would be forced to negotiate a new, lenient payment plan. They were betting their entire legacy on the assumption that nobody wanted their ruined mess. They did not notice Attorney Davis standing in the front row. Davis wore an immaculate navy suit and held a leather briefcase. He looked like any other high-end corporate representative sent to acquire distressed assets. I dialed his private number. He answered on the first ring and slipped his phone into his breast pocket, keeping the microphone exposed. The ambient noise of the courthouse steps transmitted clearly through my speaker. I could hear the rustle of winter coats, the low murmur of local real estate flippers, and the sharp metallic click of a microphone being switched on. The county auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium. He was a tall, stern man who possessed zero patience for sentimentality. He adjusted his glasses and began reading the legal description of the Lawrence parcel. He listed the acreage, the zoning parameters, and the original construction date. Every word he spoke felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of my family prestige. Through the windshield, I watched Richard bow his head. Preston chewed nervously on his bottom lip. His previous arrogance entirely evaporated. The auctioneer announced the starting bid. The figure was staggering. It represented the exact remaining balance of the toxic commercial loan Preston had secured. The number hung in the cold morning air. For 10 agonizing seconds, the plaza remained perfectly silent. Nobody raised a paddle. Nobody cleared their throat. From my vantage point, I saw Preston exhale a visible cloud of white breath. He looked at my father and offered a weak, hopeful nod. They thought they had survived. They thought the bank was going to eat the loss. Then a voice cut through the freezing wind. It came from a man standing near the center of the crowd. He wore a sharp charcoal overcoat and a silk scarf. I recognized his type instantly. He was a corporate developer from a predatory firm out of Atlanta. Those firms specialized in purchasing historic Appalachian plots, bulldozing the antique timber structures, and paving over the rich soil to build cheap, identical residential subdivisions. He raised his numbered placard and accepted the opening bid. If that man won, my home would be reduced to splintered kindling by the end of the month. The legacy of my great-great-grandfather would become a paved cul-de-sac surrounded by vinyl siding. My heart hammered against my ribs. I leaned forward, gripping the leather steering wheel. Before the auctioneer could acknowledge the Atlanta developer, a new voice rang out. Attorney Davis raised his paddle. He spoke clearly and calmly, acting as the designated proxy for Heritage Preservation, LLC. He increased the bid by $10,000. The crowd murmured in surprise. Preston whipped his head around, staring at the back of Davis' head. Richard gripped the edge of the stone fountain, his knuckles turning white. Their delusion of a quiet cancellation died instantly. They were watching a live corporate battle over their stolen birthright. The Atlanta developer frowned. He looked at Davis and quickly raised his paddle again, adding another $20,000 to the pot. He wanted to intimidate the competition. He wanted to signal that his firm possessed infinite capital. Davis did not even blink. He raised his placard and bumped the price by another $20,000. The pacing of the auction accelerated into a rapid-fire volley. The numbers climbed higher and higher, echoing off the stone pillars of the courthouse. The developer grew increasingly agitated. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and began scribbling frantic calculations onto a small notepad. He was running a strict profit margin algorithm in his head. He needed to acquire the land cheap enough to make his subdivision project viable. The price was rapidly approaching his corporate ceiling. The developer threw out a punishing sum, hoping to land a knockout blow. He bid a figure that made several local investors gasp aloud. It was an exorbitant amount of money for a half-demolished property in rural Tennessee. I listened to the number echo through my phone speaker. The Atlanta buyer thought he was playing a game of corporate mathematics. He did not realize he was fighting a woman fueled by 30 years of rejection, holding a lottery ticket worth $1.5 million in pure, untraceable liquid cash. I spoke into the receiver. My voice was cold and steady. I told Davis to end the game. I gave him authorization to deliver a devastating, overwhelming cash bid that would obliterate any logical profit margin the developer calculated. Davis nodded slightly, acknowledging my command through the hidden phone. He raised his paddle one final time. He announced the new figure. His voice carried over the crowd with lethal authority. The plaza fell dead silent. The sum was astronomical. It was a number only a true owner with deep personal motivation and boundless resources would ever justify paying. The Atlanta developer stopped writing. He stared at Davis with a mixture of shock and disgust. He slowly lowered his numbered placard and tucked his silver pen back into his overcoat. He was out. The auctioneer scanned the quiet crowd looking for any final challengers. The only sound remaining was the low rustle of the winter wind. "Going once," the auctioneer called out. "Going twice. Sold to Heritage Preservation, LLC." The wooden gavel struck the podium. The rhythmic, heart-pounding tap cracked through the cold morning air. The sound marked the official legal transfer of 7 generations of history. The estate was sold. The debt was cleared. The property belonged to me. Through the windshield, I watched the physical toll of that wooden strike manifest on my family. Preston stumbled backward as if an invisible hand had shoved him hard in the chest. He bumped into the stone fountain, looking around in absolute horror. Richard closed his eyes and buried his face in his trembling hands. The Grand Lawrence legacy was formally handed over to a faceless ghost corporation. They had no idea who owned their home. They had no idea where they were going to sleep. I reached over and ended the phone call. The digital screen faded to black. A profound, deeply satisfying warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill of the truck cabin. I owned the deed. I held the keys to the kingdom. But my family still believed they were dealing with a distant, oblivious corporate entity. They still possessed an ingrained, toxic sense of entitlement. I knew their arrogant minds were already plotting a new scheme. They would try to manipulate the anonymous buyer. They would try to refuse the eviction. They were about to learn that the new landlord did not negotiate with parasites. The afternoon following the courthouse auction brought a strange, eerie calm to the valley. I expected to see moving trucks parked outside the homestead by sunset. I anticipated witnessing my parents hauling cardboard boxes filled with 30 years of accumulated memories down the long gravel driveway. Instead, a bizarre, toxic tranquility settled over the property. I parked my truck near the ridge and watched the house through my binoculars. Inside the dining room, my mother stood, surrounded by half-demolished walls and exposed electrical wires. She was not panicking or weeping over her lost social status. She held a stack of delicate floral porcelain plates. She carefully wrapped each piece of her fine china in thin white tissue paper, placing them gently into a small padded leather trunk. She moved with the serene grace of a wealthy woman preparing for a brief weekend getaway. The visual contrast between the gutted, ruined architecture and her calm, meticulous packing revealed the profound depth of her denial. The sheer audacity of their delusion was breathtaking. Richard and Diane refused to accept their sudden poverty. They had spent decades building an impenetrable social fortress based on inherited wealth and Southern prestige. Admitting defeat meant stepping outside that fortress into a harsh reality they deeply despised. Preston provided the perfect psychological escape hatch for their fragile egos. Because Heritage Preservation LLC operated behind a heavy veil of legal anonymity, my brother assumed the new owner was a distant, faceless corporate conglomerate located in a skyscraper hundreds of miles away. Corporate entities, in his mind, did not care about rural Tennessee property disputes. They only cared about abstract spreadsheets and tax write-offs. Preston concocted a strategy to exploit this perceived corporate indifference. He gathered my parents in the freezing parlor and outlined his scheme. He proposed they simply refuse to vacate the premises when the time came. He claimed they could manipulate the out-of-state buyers by offering to serve as on-site caretakers. He reasoned a large investment firm would much rather have a distinguished local family protecting their fresh acquisition from vandals than leave the historic estate vacant during the winter months. If the company refused this generous offer, Preston planned to weaponize squatter rights. He promised to drag the corporate lawyers through years of sluggish local litigation. They truly believed the rules governing normal working-class citizens did not apply to the Lawrence family. They felt entitled to inhabit a home they had legally forfeited. I did not allow their arrogance to fester unchallenged. The very next morning, I sat in Attorney Davis' office and finalized the lethal paperwork. We bypassed standard postal delivery methods. I paid a premium fee to hire an elite private process server, ensuring the documents were handed directly to the occupants. The server arrived at the homestead just before noon on a dreary, overcast Tuesday. I listened to the live audio feed through a hidden microphone Davis discreetly installed in the server's lapel. The heavy oak front door creaked open. Preston answered, wearing a plush terry cloth bathrobe and expensive leather slippers. The server clearly stated his legal purpose and handed over a thick manila envelope. Inside that envelope rested an ironclad formal eviction mandate drafted by the sharpest real estate litigator in Nashville. The legal language was unforgiving and airtight. It demanded the immediate surrender of the property by 8 o'clock on Friday morning. It promised severe criminal trespassing charges and immediate police intervention for any noncompliance. Preston did not tremble when he read the bold print. He did not call my father in a sudden frantic panic. Through the crisp audio feed, I heard a sharp, distinct sound. My brother laughed. It was a genuine, amused chuckle echoing in the foyer. He told the process server to have a safe drive back to the city. He proudly boasted that corporate evictions take at least 6 months to process through the sluggish Tennessee judicial system. He claimed his personal attorneys would tie the LLC up in bureaucratic red tape until the next decade. Then, he crumpled the pristine legal document into a tight ball and tossed it into a nearby wicker trash can. The heavy door slammed shut, ending the transmission. His hubris was a staggering display of pure foolishness. He assumed he held the upper hand against a bored junior executive sitting in a distant cubicle. He did not realize he was playing a lethal game of survival against the sister he had so casually discarded. I used the remaining days of the week to meticulously prepare for my homecoming. I felt no anxiety or apprehension. Their thick blanket of denial provided me with an uninterrupted window to finalize my restoration blueprints. I sat at my drafting table under the warm amber glow of a desk lamp. I unrolled large sheets of thick grid paper, tracing the original architectural lines of the 19th century timber frame. I calculated the exact volume of reclaimed white oak needed to repair the structural damage Preston inflicted on the west wing. I mapped out the proper vintage joinery techniques required to secure the grand staircase. Every precise pencil stroke served as a therapeutic counterweight to the chaotic mess my family created. I was not merely reclaiming a stolen piece of land. I was orchestrating the resurrection of a historical masterpiece. The psychological gap between my focused preparation and their toxic entitlement grew wider with every passing hour. Thursday evening draped the Appalachian foothills in a dense, freezing fog. Inside the gutted estate, my family engaged in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. They packed a few light overnight bags, assuming they might need to spend a single evening at a local hotel, while Preston charmed the arriving corporate representative. They left their heavy winter coats hanging in the cedar closets. They left the antique silver, polished and neatly arranged on the dining room sideboard. They left their expensive toiletries sitting on the bathroom counters. They genuinely believed Friday morning would bring a polite negotiation over hot coffee, resulting in a lucrative caretaking contract and a renewed lease on their kingdom. Meanwhile, I stood inside my quiet workshop, wiping down my steel tools with a soft, oiled rag. The metallic scent of brass and iron grounded my racing thoughts. I opened a small cardboard box sitting on my wooden workbench. Inside rested a brand new set of heavy-duty brass deadbolts. I selected the largest lock, feeling its cool, solid weight resting securely in my palm. The internal mechanism was flawless, unyielding, and impossible to bypass. I placed the deadbolts into the deep canvas pouches of my leather tool belt. I lined up my sharpest chisels, my heavy wooden mallet, and my high-powered cordless drill. The stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic collision of realities. My parents and my brother were sleeping soundly, wrapped in their fragile illusion of unearned privilege. They expected a faceless lawyer in a tailored suit to show up at dawn, carrying a briefcase full of negotiable contracts. They expected to manipulate a gullible stranger using their tired Southern charm. But the sun was about to rise over the Franklin Valley, and the new landlord was bringing a fresh set of keys. Friday morning broke with a deceptive stillness across the valley. A low mist clung to the damp soil, masking the ruin of the ancestral estate. Inside the gutted parlor, my family sipped hot coffee, poured from a silver carafe. They wore their finest casual attire, anticipating a civilized negotiation. They believed a corporate representative would arrive carrying a leather briefcase filled with compromises. They expected polite handshakes and deferred timelines. At precisely 8 o'clock, the illusion shattered. The harsh crunch of heavy tires rolling over the familiar gravel driveway severed the quiet morning air. 2 pristine white county cruisers turned off the rural highway and advanced toward the wraparound porch. The vehicles did not park near the sheds or pause at the perimeter. They drove directly up to the front steps, establishing immediate authority. Sheriff Dalton stepped out of the lead cruiser. He was a veteran lawman with cold gray eyes and a rigid posture hardened by decades of dealing with rural disputes. He did not carry a clipboard or wear a friendly smile. He rested his right hand on his dark utility belt, signaling a zero-tolerance policy for any impending theatrics. 2 younger deputies flanked him, their expressions equally unyielding. Preston walked out the front door holding a porcelain coffee cup. He pasted a bright, charismatic grin across his face, attempting to deploy the legendary Lawrence charm. He greeted Dalton by his first name, asking if the officers were lost or simply stopping by for a morning cup of coffee. He projected the relaxed confidence of a wealthy man accustomed to treating local law enforcement like a private security detail. Dalton did not return the greeting. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a folded legal document. The crisp white paper bore the official embossed seal of the county court. He extended his arm, holding the mandate out for Preston to take. My brother refused to accept the paperwork. He chuckled, shaking his head. He told the sheriff there was a simple administrative misunderstanding regarding a corporate lien. He promised his personal attorneys were currently sorting out the clerical error with the out-of-state buyers. He assumed the badge-wearing officers would simply nod, apologize for the intrusion, and drive away. Dalton closed the distance between them and pressed the document firmly against Preston's chest, forcing him to grab the paper or let it fall to the porch floor. The sheriff stated his orders clearly. The words cut through the mist like a sharpened blade. He informed my brother that Heritage Preservation, LLC, held the sole legal right of possession. The grace period had officially expired at midnight. Dalton issued a non-negotiable ultimatum. The family had exactly 60 minutes to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises. If a single person remained on the property at 9 o'clock, they would be handcuffed, placed in the back of a squad car, and booked into the county jail for criminal trespassing. The charismatic grin vanished from Preston's face. The porcelain coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the wooden porch boards. Hot, dark liquid splashed onto his leather shoes. The reality of the situation finally pierced his thick armor of entitlement. This was not a clerical error or a friendly negotiation. This was a forced physical removal. Inside the foyer, my father dropped his newspaper. Richard rushed to the doorway, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He demanded to speak to the local judge. He shouted about his country club connections and threatened to have the deputies fired for harassing prominent citizens. Dalton remained perfectly still, a stone wall absorbing a pathetic wave of bluster. The sheriff tapped his wristwatch and noted that 5 minutes had already passed. Panic erupted within the ruined walls of the homestead. The leisurely morning transformed into a frantic, terrifying scramble for survival. My parents suddenly realized their light overnight bags were woefully insufficient. They needed to pack their entire existence into a handful of suitcases before the ticking clock ran out. The pacing of the next 50 minutes was brutal and chaotic. I sat inside my truck a mile down the road, listening to the local police scanner frequency, monitoring the scene from a safe distance. I could picture the humiliation unfolding in real time. Diane wept openly, her pristine Southern Belle image fractured under the sheer terror of sudden homelessness. She ran up the grand staircase, her heels slipping on the bare wood. She dragged heavy designer luggage from the cedar closets, frantically stuffing expensive silk blouses and tailored dresses into the compartments. Zippers broke under the strain. Piles of clothing spilled onto the dusty floorboards. She realized she could not carry her antique jewelry boxes, her fine china, and her winter coats all at once. She was forced to choose what pieces of her identity to abandon in the wreckage. Richard abandoned his threats and focused on salvaging his hidden cash reserves and financial ledgers. He cursed the banks, he cursed the economy, and he cursed the invisible corporate executives who orchestrated this hostile takeover. The only person he refused to blame was the son who signed their legacy away. Preston ran aimlessly through the gutted hallways. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. He hauled a heavy leather trunk out the front door, dragging it across the pristine lawn because the wheels snapped off on the porch steps. The heavy trunk gouged deep, ugly trenches into the damp soil. He piled suitcases, cardboard boxes, and loose winter coats into a haphazard mound near the front gate. The true social devastation occurred shortly before 9 o'clock. The rural highway bordering the estate served as a primary commuter route for the affluent residents of Franklin. As my family dragged their worldly possessions through the mud, the morning traffic began to slow down. Neighbors driving luxury SUVs and imported sedans tapped their brakes, peering through their tinted windows. The Montgomery family, who owned the adjacent horse farm, idled at the stop sign, watching Diane openly sobbing on the front lawn with mascara running down her cheeks. The impenetrable facade of the Lawrence dynasty shattered in front of an eager, captive audience. They were no longer the elite rulers of the valley. They were a cautionary tale, broadcast in broad daylight. Desperation drove Preston to his breaking point. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He accessed the eviction notice Dalton handed him, searching for a contact number for Heritage Preservation, LLC. He assumed a corporate executive was monitoring the situation from a high-rise office. He planned to offer them double the monthly rent, triple the security deposit, anything to halt the humiliating spectacle. He punched the numbers into his screen and pressed call. Inside the quiet cab of my Silverado, my cheap prepaid burner phone lit up. The device vibrated against the plastic cup holder, producing a harsh, rhythmic buzzing sound. I stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed my brother's name. He was dialing his own executioner, begging for a stay of execution. I did not answer the call. I simply watched the screen flash until the automated voicemail system took over. Let him leave a message. Let him scream his empty promises into the digital void. At 9 o'clock sharp, Sheriff Dalton stepped off the porch and ordered the family to step behind the wrought iron gates at the edge of the property line. The physical eviction was complete. They were locked out of their own kingdom. The deputies supervised the retreat, ensuring every member of the household stood on the public shoulder of the highway. Richard stood rigid, staring at the dirt. Diane leaned against a pile of designer luggage, covering her face with trembling hands. Preston paced back and forth, gripping his silent phone. They huddled near the stone pillars marking the entrance to the estate. Despite the overwhelming evidence of their ruin, a tiny, stubborn sliver of denial still burned in their minds. They watched the highway, looking for a sleek black Mercedes or a polished corporate town car. They believed the LLC representative would eventually arrive to officially take possession of the keys. They planned to ambush this stranger, throwing their pride into the dirt, to beg bribe or threaten their way back across the threshold. I placed my burner phone into my tool belt. I shifted the Silverado into gear. The heavy tires gripped the asphalt as I pulled out of my hiding spot and drove toward the homestead. The family heard the deep rumble of an approaching engine. They straightened their postures, wiping the dirt from their coats, attempting to summon whatever shreds of dignity they still possessed. They prepared to face a ruthless corporate titan. They watched the road, anticipating the arrival of a wealthy stranger. Instead, a familiar, dusty work truck hauling a bed full of reclaimed timber turned off the highway. The tires crunched over the gravel driveway, kicking up a thick cloud of white dust. I drove right past their huddled figures. I did not slow down to acknowledge their presence at the gate. I steered the Silverado up the long, winding path and pulled directly to a stop right in front of the grand porch. The heavy engine of the Silverado sputtered and died. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the Appalachian foothills. A thick cloud of white gravel dust rolled forward, washing over the front steps of the ruined estate. I sat behind the steering wheel for a brief moment, allowing the dust to settle. I looked through my rearview mirror. Down at the perimeter of the property, near the wrought iron gates, my family stood, frozen. They stared at the back of my truck. Their faces were twisted in a mixture of profound confusion and desperate hope. Preston was the first to move. He assumed my arrival was a fortunate coincidence or a tragic mistake. He jogged up the long driveway, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the loose stones. He likely believed the mysterious corporate representative was running late, and I had simply shown up to retrieve my forgotten tools. Richard and Diane followed close behind him, their designer luggage sitting abandoned in the mud. Sheriff Dalton remained near his cruiser, watching the interaction unfold with cold, professional detachment. He allowed them to approach the porch to facilitate whatever final handover needed to happen before he enforced the trespassing perimeter. I pushed the driver's side door open. My heavy canvas work boots hit the ground with a solid, resonant thud. The brass buckles on my leather tool belt clinked into place. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the grand entrance. Preston reached the base of the wooden steps, panting slightly. He wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead. He looked at my worn flannel shirt and my calloused hands. His expression shifted from confusion to intense irritation. He demanded to know what I was doing on the property. He told me I was trespassing on a secured corporate site. He warned me that a powerful investment executive was arriving at any moment to take possession of the keys, and my presence was going to ruin their delicate negotiations. I did not offer him a single syllable in response. I walked past him, ascending the stairs with steady, measured strides. Diane reached the edge of the lawn, her breathing shallow and ragged. She clutched a pristine white leather handbag against her chest. She saw me standing on the porch, and her mind constructed a new convenient narrative. She forced a bright, brittle smile. She called out my name, assuming I had finally buckled under the pressure of familial duty. She asked if the bank hired me to board up the windows. She pleaded with me to help them load their suitcases into the back of my truck. She insisted we needed to hide their valuables before the ruthless new landlord arrived. I ignored her pleas. I reached the heavy oak front door. The old deadbolt mechanism sat dull and tarnished against the wood. I reached into the deep pouch of my tool belt and pulled out my high-powered cordless drill. I pressed the sharp steel bit directly against the center of the brass keyhole. I squeezed the trigger. The high-pitched screech of grinding metal ripped through the quiet morning air. Silver and gold shavings spiraled outward, falling onto the porch boards like metallic snow. The sound was jarring and destructive. It was the sound of an era ending. Preston lost whatever fragile composure he still possessed. His face flushed a deep, furious red. He bounded up the steps, taking them two at a time. He shouted my name, ordering me to stop destroying corporate property. He reached out and grabbed my left forearm, attempting to yank the drill away from the door. I released the trigger. The screeching drill spun to a halt. I stepped backward, breaking his weak physical grip. I turned to face him. The air between us grew freezing and still. My brother glared at me, his eyes wide with frantic indignation. He told me I was going to get them all arrested. He insisted the Heritage Preservation LLC representatives would file criminal vandalism charges against the entire family if they saw me destroying the hardware. I reached into the inner pocket of my flannel vest. My fingers brushed against the crisp, heavy parchment of the certified deed. I pulled the document into the cold morning light. The county seal gleamed near the bottom margin. The embossed stamps verified the highest tier of legal ownership. I held the paper in both hands and unfolded it with agonizing slowness. I made sure Preston could see the bold black ink printed across the header. I looked into his panicked eyes. I kept my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Heritage Preservation LLC, I stated, "That is me." The psychological devastation was instantaneous and absolute. The invisible shockwave struck all three of them simultaneously. Down on the grass, my father lost his breath. Richard's face turned a sickly, pale gray. The patriarch realized his entire worldview was a hollow lie. His golden son was a destitute failure, and the discarded spare daughter held the keys to the kingdom. He swayed on his feet, grasping the wooden porch railing to keep from collapsing. Diane stood frozen, her brittle smile shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her fingers went limp. The pristine white leather handbag slipped from her grasp. It tumbled through the air and struck the muddy ground with a dull, heavy thud. The pristine designer material soaked up the dirty brown water. She did not even blink. She just stared at me, her mind unable to process the magnitude of her own ruin. Preston stared at the embossed legal document. His brain malfunctioned attempting to calculate an impossible equation. He knew my hourly rate. He knew the modest income of my restoration business. He stammered, stumbling over his own tongue. He demanded to know how I orchestrated the purchase. He demanded to know where a simple timber framer acquired millions of dollars in liquid cash to outbid corporate developers. "I bought it with the future you tried to steal from me," I replied. The silence that followed was heavier than the timber beams supporting the roof. The 30 years of neglect, the toxic favoritism, and the endless cruel dismissals were officially leveled. The power dynamic flipped with the devastating force of a falling redwood. Desperation immediately replaced their arrogance. Preston dropped his hands to his sides, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. He took a step forward, his voice cracking. He begged me to listen to reason. He reminded me that we shared the same blood. He pleaded for a temporary reprieve, asking for just a few weeks to sort out his finances. Diane found her voice. Her tone was small and broken. She stepped onto the bottom stair, ignoring her ruined handbag in the mud. She asked me if they could just use the guest room. She promised they would stay out of my way. She swore Preston would find a job and pay me rent. They frantically attempted to backtrack, trying to rewrite decades of abuse in a matter of seconds. They demanded entry to the home they had legally forfeited and morally abandoned. I turned my back on them. I raised the drill and squeezed the trigger one final time. The old lock cylinder snapped and gave way. I pulled the ruined hardware out of the wood and tossed it onto the floorboards. I reached into my pouch and retrieved the new heavy-duty brass deadbolt. I slid the pristine mechanism into the circular hole. I fastened the steel screws securing the lock into the ancient oak. I pulled a shiny new brass key from my pocket. I slotted the metal into the deadbolt. I turned my wrist. The internal tumblers aligned. The deadbolt slid into the doorframe with a definitive, echoing click. The homestead was sealed. I turned around and looked down at my abusers. I met my mother's weeping eyes. I met my father's hollow stare. I met my brother's pathetic, trembling gaze. "No vacancy here," I said. I pulled the key from the lock and dropped it into my pocket. Preston spun around wildly, the last shreds of his sanity tearing apart. He looked down the long driveway toward Sheriff Dalton, who was slowly walking up the path to enforce the deadline. My brother's face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged denial. He was preparing to launch a desperate, chaotic legal war on the front lawn. He was about to demand the police arrest me for fraud, setting the stage for a public humiliation he could never survive. The gravel crunched beneath Preston's expensive shoes as he sprinted down the long driveway. He waved his arms wildly above his head, shouting for the sheriff. Dalton paused near the front bumper of his white cruiser. He rested his thumbs on his dark utility belt, watching my brother approach with the exhausted patience of a man who dealt with daily rural hysteria. Preston reached the officer, panting heavily. He pointed a trembling finger back toward the porch where I stood. He demanded my immediate arrest. He accused me of orchestrating a complex corporate fraud. He insisted there was a catastrophic legal mistake. He claimed a lowly timber framer could never assemble the capital required to purchase a historic Appalachian estate in cash. He demanded the police confiscate my keys and launch a full criminal investigation into my hidden finances. Sheriff Dalton did not draw his weapon. He did not call for backup. He simply sighed and began walking up the gravel path. The heavy tread of his boots cut through my brother's frantic, overlapping accusations. Dalton climbed the porch steps and stopped a few feet away from me. He tipped the brim of his hat in a neutral, professional greeting. He asked if I possessed the formal documentation required to substantiate my claim of ownership. I did not argue or raise my voice. I reached into the inner pocket of my vest and retrieved a thick manila folder. I handed the heavy envelope to the officer. The morning sky remained heavily overcast, blocking the sun behind a thick wall of gray clouds. Dalton reached into his tactical vest and retrieved a small, heavy-duty metal flashlight. He clicked the button on the tail cap. A bright beam of concentrated white light illuminated the porch. He aimed the beam directly onto the top sheet of paper. The circle of light swept across the printed ink. It highlighted the formal registration of Heritage Preservation, LLC. It illuminated the blind trust verification numbers. The beam paused on the official court-ordered auction receipt, proving the debt was paid in full. Finally, the sheriff shined the light over the bottom corner of the master deed. The illumination cast deep shadows across the raised ridges of the embossed county seal. The notarized signature sat crisp and undeniable beneath the stamp. The paperwork was pristine. It was forged in the sharpest legal minds of Nashville, and it possessed the structural integrity of a titanium vault. Dalton clicked his flashlight off and returned the heavy metal cylinder to his vest. He slid the documents back into the manila envelope and handed the folder to me. He turned around to face my brother. The verdict fell from the officer's lips with cold, lethal authority. He told Preston the documents were flawless. He stated I was the sole legal owner of the parcel, the structures, and the surrounding acreage. He looked Preston directly in the eye and delivered a final, stern warning. Dalton informed my family that the formal eviction deadline had expired. He explained that any person remaining on the grass, the driveway, or the porch was currently committing the crime of trespassing. He ordered them to pack their bags and move their vehicles off the private boundaries within 5 minutes, or he would place them in handcuffs. The legal shield my family worshipped their entire lives turned into a spear. The law did not care about their country club memberships or their Southern pedigree. The law only recognized the ink on the deed. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the sheriff, and then he looked at my father. He searched for a lifeline, for someone to step forward and fix the mess he created. Richard Lawrence stood near the mud-stained luggage. The patriarch of the family stared at the ground. For 30 years, he had groomed Preston to inherit the kingdom. He had excused the failed business ventures, the reckless spending, and the endless arrogance. He had sacrificed my future on the altar of his son's potential. But the illusion of the golden child could not survive the harsh glare of the morning light. The reality of their destitution finally broke the spell. Richard lifted his head. his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not aim his fury at me or the sheriff. He turned his burning gaze directly onto Preston. "You ruined us," Richard hissed. His voice shook with a venom I had never heard him use before. Preston recoiled, taking a step backward. He raised his hands defensively and tried to blame the greedy commercial lenders. He tried to blame the slow local economy. Richard cut him off, stepping forward and pointing an accusing finger at his son's chest. "You took a debt-free historic home and you gambled it away on a pathetic fantasy. You threw away 7 generations of our bloodline because you are too lazy to work a real job. You lost the legacy." The verbal execution echoed across the lawn. Preston shrank under the weight of his father's disgust. The fragile, conditional nature of the golden child dynamic was exposed for the entire world to witness. Preston was only loved as long as he provided the illusion of success. The moment he failed, he became the scapegoat. He became worthless. Diane remained kneeling in the damp soil next to her ruined designer handbag. She covered her face and wept, mourning the death of her social empire. She did not defend her son. She did not comfort her husband. She simply surrendered to the mud. I stood silently on the porch, a stoic witness to their self-destruction. I did not need to yell or gloat. I did not need to explain how much they had hurt me over the past 3 decades. The legally binding documents resting in my vest pocket did all the fighting for me. The silence was my ultimate victory. The sheriff cleared his throat, breaking the tense tableau. He pointed toward the road and reminded them the clock was ticking. The retreat was an agonizing display of humiliation. My family was forced to drag their mud-soaked suitcases across the lawn. They abandoned their heavy trunks and excess boxes, leaving their prized possessions sitting in the damp grass. They walked toward the edge of the property line, where Preston's dark sedan sat parked on the shoulder of the rural highway. The sedan was a luxury import, but it was a hollow symbol. I knew from reviewing the financial ledgers that the vehicle was 3 months behind on its lease payments. The bank was actively hunting that car for repossession. It was only a matter of time before a tow truck arrived to snatch their last remaining asset in the middle of the night. Preston popped the trunk. Richard shoved his luggage into the cramped compartment using brutal, unnecessary force. Diane climbed into the back seat, pulling her cashmere shawl over her head to hide her face from the passing morning traffic. Preston slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. They sat inside the idling car, hollowed out by the undeniable reality of my dominance. They were homeless, broke, and publicly ruined. They possessed nowhere to go and nobody left to call. I stood on the porch of my ancestral home and watched their exhaust pipe spew a cloud of white smoke into the cold air. The sedan shifted into gear, preparing to drive away toward a cheap motel on the county line. But before they could merge onto the highway, a dark, sleek vehicle pulled up to the gate, blocking their exit path. The driver's side door opened, and a familiar figure stepped out onto the asphalt. The final fracture was about to occur, and the timing could not have been more perfect. The sleek, dark sedan blocked the exit path, sitting perpendicular across the end of the gravel driveway. The vehicle idled with a smooth, quiet hum. The driver's side door opened, and Camille stepped out onto the damp asphalt. She wore a tailored camel coat and polished leather boots, looking entirely untouched by the muddy, chaotic ruin surrounding my family. She closed her car door with a solid, authoritative thud. She walked to the rear passenger door and opened it. She reached inside and retrieved a medium-sized cardboard box. The container was filled with the final remnants of Preston's previous life. I could see the glint of his overpriced golf trophies, his imported cologne bottles, and a few tailored silk ties. She carried the heavy box with effortless posture. As a former senior financial auditor, Camille spent her entire professional career calculating risk and mitigating disaster. She knew exactly how to sever dead weight from a failing ledger. Camille approached the property line and stopped a few feet away from the idling, repossessed sedan. She surveyed the pathetic scene unfolding on the public shoulder of the highway. She observed Diane weeping in the back seat with a cashmere shawl pulled over her head. She noted Richard's defeated, hollow stare from the passenger side. Finally, she lifted her gaze at the long driveway and saw me standing on the porch. She noticed the heavy-duty brass deadbolt shining against the historic oak door. She saw the manila folder resting in my hand. I watched her analytical mind process the variables. She spent years tracking corporate shell companies and hidden trust funds. She connected the dots with the speed of a supercomputer. She realized Heritage Preservation, LLC, was not a distant conglomerate. She understood the silent, abandoned sister had purchased the ancestral estate in cash. Camille did not express shock or disbelief. She did not offer a single ounce of pity for her ruined husband. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes across the expanse of the ruined lawn. She offered a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound respect. It was a silent acknowledgement between two women who refused to serve as collateral damage for a mediocre man. I returned the nod, holding her gaze. The alliance we forged during that miserable Sunday dinner was officially validated. Preston scrambled out of the driver's seat. He left his door hanging wide open. The internal warning chime of his car dinged rhythmically, adding a pathetic, mechanical soundtrack to his desperation. He practically tripped over his own feet, rushing toward his estranged wife. He saw the cardboard box in her arms, and his delusional mind immediately misinterpreted the situation. He believed she had arrived to offer a rescue mission. He reached out, attempting to place his trembling hands on her shoulders. Camille took a swift step backward, creating a harsh physical boundary. Preston dropped his hands, but continued speaking at a frantic, breathless pace. He begged her for a lifeline. He told her a catastrophic clerical error had occurred. He spun a wild, fabricated story about a corrupt bank manager and a fraudulent auction. He claimed the local sheriff was conspiring against the Lawrence dynasty. Then he pivoted to his ultimate objective. He lowered his voice, adopting a sickeningly sweet tone he usually reserved for manipulating our mother. He mentioned the luxury downtown apartment Camille had leased after their separation. He said he just needed a temporary place to crash. He asked if he and his parents could sleep in her spare rooms for a few weeks while his phantom venture capital investors cleared the bureaucratic red tape. He promised he would pay her back with exorbitant interest the moment his funds cleared. Camille stared at him with chilling indifference. She did not raise her voice. She did not scream or cry. She dropped the cardboard box directly into the mud at his feet. The heavy cardboard hit the wet earth with a thick sound. A glass bottle of expensive cologne shattered inside, spilling fragrant liquid over the crushed silk ties. Preston flinched, staring down at his ruined belongings. Camille delivered a surgical, verbal strike. She told him his venture capital investors never existed. She stated his entire business model was a narcissistic fantasy built on the back of his parents' stolen retirement. She reminded him that she spent countless hours warning him about soaring interest rates and toxic commercial loans. She pointed out that he ignored every single financial warning because he truly believed his surname made him invincible. You gambled a pristine, debt-free legacy on your own ego, Camille said. Her words cut through the cold morning mist. You bankrupted your mother and your father. You tried to drag my flawless credit score down into your self-made abyss. I am a professional risk assessor, Preston. You are the worst investment I have ever witnessed. My spare bedrooms are reserved for guests who actually possess a future. You are a liability, and I am officially closing your account. Preston stood paralyzed. The remaining shreds of his southern charm dissolved into nothing. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He looked like a stranded fish gasping for oxygen. Inside the sedan, Richard turned his head away, unable to watch his son endure the brutal truth. Diane sobbed louder, burying her face deeper into her cashmere shawl. They realized their last potential savior had just slammed the door shut. Camille reached for her left hand. She slowly pulled off her soft leather glove, tucking it into the pocket of her camel coat. The dull gray sky offered no sunlight, but the heavy diamond on her ring finger still managed to catch a faint glint of the morning. She gripped the platinum band with her right thumb and index finger. She slid the jewelry over her knuckle. She stepped forward and placed the wedding ring onto the roof of his repossessed sedan. The precious metal struck the cold, painted steel. The sound was a sharp, hollow clink that resonated above the rhythm of the idling engine. The pebble of sound signified the total collapse of his marriage. "You wanted to be the man of the house," Camille whispered, her voice carrying a lethal finality. "Find one." She turned her back on him. She did not look at my parents. She did not look back up at the porch. She walked to her dark sedan with the steady, unbothered posture of a woman walking away from a burning building. She climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The vehicle reversed smoothly onto the rural highway. She shifted into drive and accelerated down the road, disappearing into the morning fog. She took the last remaining fragments of logic and grace away with her. Preston stared at the wedding ring sitting on the roof of his car. He did not reach for it. He let it sit there, a tiny, glittering monument to his monumental failure. He slowly turned his head and looked at the muddy cardboard box resting near his ruined leather shoes. He possessed nothing else in the world. He climbed back into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The warning chime ceased. He sat behind the steering wheel, gripping the leather rim with white knuckles. He stared through the windshield at the long gravel driveway he could never traverse again. I turned away from the porch railing. I walked inside the foyer and closed the heavy oak door. I engaged the new brass deadbolt, listening to the satisfying click of the internal mechanism. I walked into the parlor and stood by the grand front window. I peered through the antique glass panes. Down on the highway, the cramped sedan remained parked on the shoulder. My family was completely isolated. They were cut off from the wealth, the status, and the enablers they had relied upon for 3 decades. They had nowhere to drive and no money to purchase fuel. I watched them sit in the cold, idling vehicle. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I remained unmoved, watching the natural consequences of their cruelty finally take root in the frozen Tennessee soil. The afternoon sun slipped behind the jagged Appalachian ridgeline, casting long, dark shadows across the valley. The temperature plummeted as twilight settled over the Tennessee landscape. A bitter frost began to form on the bare branches of the ancient oak trees. Down on the shoulder of the rural highway, the repossessed sedan remained parked in the exact same spot. Plumes of white exhaust curled from the tailpipe. My family had spent the last 4 hours sitting inside that cramped vehicle, trapped in a suffocating limbo. They had exhausted every legal avenue. Their financial resources were drained to the final penny. The friends they considered elite peers refused to answer their desperate phone calls. They possessed nowhere to go, and the freezing night was closing in rapidly. I stood inside the darkened parlor, watching the highway through the antique window panes. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I preferred the quiet obscurity of the shadows. I knew their arrogant minds were churning, calculating a new strategy. My father and my brother were cowards when faced with actual adversity. They relied on bluster and unearned authority. When those tools failed, they invariably sent a woman to do their dirty work. The passenger door of the sedan finally opened. Diane stepped out into the frigid evening air. My mother did not look like the regal matriarch who dominated country club luncheons. Her expensive cashmere shawl was stained with mud from her earlier collapse on the lawn. Her meticulously styled hair hung limp around her pale face. She wrapped her arms tightly around her frail torso, shivering in the cold. She left Richard and Preston hiding inside the heated car and began the long, humiliating walk up the gravel driveway alone. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, playing the role of a wounded, fragile victim. This was a calculated performance. She knew I was watching. She wanted me to see her suffering. For 30 years, she utilized this exact tactic to enforce compliance. Whenever she demanded my free labor or required a scapegoat for Preston's mistakes, she weaponized her own vulnerability. She manufactured tears and fabricated distress to trigger my innate filial piety. She assumed the old psychological chains were still intact. I stepped away from the window and walked into the grand foyer. The space smelled of raw pine and cold earth. I stood a few feet away from the heavy oak front door, waiting for her approach. The gravel crunched softly under her ruined designer shoes. She climbed the porch steps. Her silhouette appeared behind the frosted glass pane of the entrance. She did not bang her fists or shout demands. She understood that aggression would only harden my resolve. Instead, she employed a far more insidious weapon. She aimed for my conscience. Diane placed her right palm flat against the cold glass. Her slender fingers splayed outward, pressing against the transparent barrier. In the dim moonlight, her pale hand looked exactly like a delicate trapped bird fluttering against a cage. She leaned her forehead against the wood and knocked softly. The rhythm was hesitant and deeply pathetic. "Gwyneth, darling," she called out. Her voice filtered through the thick timber, muffled but perfectly legible. It was laced with a trembling, manufactured sorrow. "Please open the door, sweetheart. It is freezing out here." I remained motionless in the dark hallway. I allowed her to speak to the silent house. "I know you are angry," she continued, her tone dripping with honeyed regret. "I know we made mistakes regarding the estate, but we are still your family. We raised you in this home. You cannot just leave us out in the cold. Your father is not a young man anymore. His heart is weak. The stress of this day is destroying his health. If he spends the night sleeping in a freezing car, he might not survive." She paused, waiting for the guilt to take root. When I did not answer, she escalated her emotional extortion. She invoked the heavy, oppressive weight of our Southern religious culture. "It is your biblical duty to honor your parents, Gwyneth." She sniffled, pressing her face closer to the glass. "We are begging you. We just need a tiny corner to rest. Give us the guest room near the pantry. We will stay out of your way. We will not touch a single thing. Please, darling, have a shred of mercy for the mother who gave you life." Standing in the shadows, I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. A biological reflex ignited deep within my nervous system. It was the ingrained, lifelong habit of seeking maternal approval. The neglected child inside me stirred, craving the rare crumbs of affection my mother currently offered. It is a terrifying reality of human psychology. An abused child does not stop loving their abuser. They simply stop loving themselves. For a fleeting, terrifying second, my hand twitched toward the brass deadbolt. A quiet, treacherous voice whispered in my mind, suggesting that maybe this time things would be different. Maybe this catastrophe would finally force them to respect me. I closed my eyes and took a slow, measured breath. I inhaled the scent of the raw timber framing surrounding me. The aroma grounded my spiraling thoughts. I opened my eyes and looked at the exposed wooden beams in the hallway. I repaired those beams with my own calloused hands while my brother purchased sports cars. I remembered the sterile law office from 30 days prior. I pictured the heavy turquoise rings on my mother's fingers. I recalled the cold, indifferent disdain in her eyes when she handed 7 generations of history to a parasitic son. I remembered the exact calculated phrasing she used to justify my disinheritance. The fake tears outside the door dissolved into meaningless noise. The spell broke, shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I stepped forward and gripped the brass latch. I turned the mechanism, releasing the deadbolt. I pulled the heavy oak door inward, opening it a mere 2 inches. The biting winter wind rushed into the foyer, carrying the scent of damp soil and exhaust fumes. Diane gasped. She stood on the porch, her face inches from the narrow opening. The moment she saw my face, the trembling sorrow vanished from her expression. A predatory gleam of triumph flashed in her eyes. She believed she had won. She reached her hand forward, attempting to push the door wider. I tightened my grip on the handle, holding the heavy wood firmly in place. The unyielding barrier stopped her advance. Her confident smile faltered. I did not yell. I did not curse or list her countless failures as a parent. Raising my voice would signify that she still held power over my emotions. Instead, I looked at her with the sterile, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a parasite. I mirrored the exact cruel rhetoric she utilized when she cast me aside. "The daughter is merely a spare," I said. My voice was soft, steady, and devoid of a single ounce of warmth. Diane recoiled as if I had struck her across the cheek. Her mouth opened, but she possessed no defense against her own quoted cruelty. The manipulative tears dried up instantly, leaving behind a hollow, terrified realization. She understood in that exact second that the emotional umbilical cord was permanently severed. "You gave your legacy to your son," I whispered through the narrow gap. "I highly suggest you go ask him for a bed." I did not wait for a response. I pushed the heavy oak door forward. The brass latch clicked shut, severing her desperate gaze. I turned the deadbolt, locking the mechanism with a definitive, echoing thud. I stood in the foyer listening to the silence of the house. The physiological anxiety in my chest evaporated entirely. I felt light, unburdened, and profoundly free. The toxic filial piety that dictated my entire existence was dead and buried. I was immune to her crocodile tears. Outside on the porch, Diane stood frozen in the cold. She did not knock again. She did not attempt to plead or bargain. The ultimate weapon in her arsenal had failed spectacularly. I listened to the slow, defeated crunch of her shoes as she turned around and walked back down the dark driveway. She returned to the idling sedan. The passenger door opened and shut. The brake lights flared bright red in the gathering darkness. The vehicle shifted into gear and pulled away from the shoulder of the highway, driving toward the county line. They were forced to seek shelter among strangers. The night swallowed their taillights, leaving the valley in perfect, peaceful solitude. But the darkness would not protect them for long. The sun would inevitably rise over the Appalachian foothills, and in the tight-knit valleys of Franklin, secrets possessed a very short lifespan. The rumors were already circulating through the local diners and banking lobbies. My family had survived the legal eviction, but they could not survive the social execution waiting for them at dawn. The rural valleys of Franklin operate on a very specific currency. In the shadow of the Appalachian foothills, cash provides comfort, but reputation determines survival. A respected surname opens heavy oak doors, secures unwritten loans, and guarantees a coveted seat at the highest tables. The Lawrence family had spent decades minting that social currency. They ruled the charity committees and dictated the local hierarchy. But when a dynasty falls in a small town, the collapse is never a private affair. The rumor mill fired into motion before the weekend concluded. Small-town bankers possess spouses. Courthouse clerks attend Sunday church services. Sheriff deputies drink cheap beer at the local taverns. The staggering details of the foreclosure leaked through a dozen different cracks in the municipal foundation. By Monday morning, every influential citizen residing in the county understood the exact mathematics of my brother's failure. They knew the Golden Son squandered a pristine, debt-free legacy. They knew the discarded daughter purchased the estate out from under him with a mountain of untraceable liquid cash. Preston experienced the lethal efficiency of this gossip firsthand. He woke up on a sagging mattress inside a cheap roadside motel near the county border. Desperate for a semblance of his former life, he drove his repossessed sedan into town. He parked outside a popular local diner situated on Main Street. He wore a wrinkled cashmere sweater and designer trousers stained with dried mud from the eviction. He expected the usual morning routine. He anticipated friendly handshakes from local business owners and a fresh pot of dark roast coffee waiting at his favorite booth. He pushed the glass door open. A small brass bell chimed, announcing his arrival. The diner was packed with the morning breakfast crowd. The air hung thick with the aroma of fried bacon and toasted sourdough. The low hum of a dozen overlapping conversations filled the space. Then, a prominent local real estate agent sitting near the counter spotted my brother. The agent lowered his coffee mug. The man sitting next to him followed his gaze. The recognition rippled outward, crossing the linoleum floor like a freezing winter wind. The clinking of silverware against ceramic plates ceased. The overlapping conversations sputtered and died. A sudden, deafening silence blanketed the entire restaurant. Preston stood in the doorway. He looked around the room, encountering a sea of hard, unblinking stares. The men he used to drink expensive scotch with averted their eyes, staring intently at their cold, scrambled eggs. The waitresses, who usually greeted him with warm smiles, wiped down the counters, refusing to acknowledge his presence. He took a hesitant step forward. A harsh, piercing whisper echoed from a corner booth. "Lost the whole property," the voice muttered. "His sister bought it in cash while he was sleeping." Preston's face flushed a dark, humiliating crimson. The crushing weight of his public ruin settled onto his shoulders. He realized he was no longer a respected entrepreneur. He was a walking punchline. He turned around and pushed the glass door open, fleeing the heavy silence. The brass bell chimed, mocking his retreat. While Preston endured his execution at the diner, my parents attempted a far more delusional strategy. Richard and Diane refused to accept their social exile. They decided to project strength, believing they could simply bluff their way through the scandal. They dressed in their finest tailored garments. Diane applied thick layers of expensive cosmetics to hide the dark circles beneath her swollen eyes. Richard wore a crisp navy blazer, hoping to project the authority he surrendered on the front porch. They drove to the elite Franklin Heritage Club. For 20 years, my mother had orchestrated the annual spring gala from the manicured dining terrace of this exact establishment. She determined who received an invitation and who remained cast out in the cold. They handed the keys of their sedan to the young valet, pretending the vehicle was not weeks away from bank seizure. They walked up the sweeping brick stairs toward the grand entrance. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. They stepped into the opulent lobby, expecting the maitre d' to guide them toward their usual private table near the grand fireplace. The club manager stepped into their path. He was a polished professional who prioritized the comfort of his paying members above all other concerns. He wore a tailored vest and a polite, unwavering smile. He did not offer his hand for Richard to shake. He informed my parents that their membership privileges were suspended. He cited a string of delinquent accounts and unpaid monthly dues. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to utilize his old bluster. He claimed the banking delays were a temporary clerical error. He demanded access to the dining room, insisting he needed to speak with his golfing peers. The manager did not budge. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of forced, polite regret. He stated the board of directors had held an emergency meeting that very morning. The club required members to maintain a standard of financial integrity. The manager gestured subtly toward the glass double doors leading to the dining terrace. Diane looked through the transparent panes. Several prominent wives from her charity committee sat sipping mimosas. They were looking directly at my mother. They did not wave. They did not smile. They turned their heads back to their conversations, dismissing her existence with brutal, chilling efficiency. The women she had manipulated and belittled for decades were finally exacting their revenge through cold indifference. My parents turned around and walked back down the brick stairs. The valet had parked their car near the edge of the lot, anticipating a swift departure. The elite high society world they valued above their own children had chewed them up and spit them out onto the asphalt. Preston attempted one final desperate maneuver to salvage his dignity. He drove to a large commercial construction firm operating on the outskirts of the valley. The company specialized in building luxury log cabins for wealthy, out-of-state clients. Preston walked into the dusty trailer office and requested an interview with the owner. He handed over a thin, printed resume. He attempted to pitch himself as an experienced project manager. He leaned heavily on his recent endeavor, claiming he possessed visionary insight into historic renovations. The owner of the firm was a grizzled foreman with calloused hands and a deep respect for raw timber. He read the flimsy piece of paper. He dropped the resume onto his cluttered desk and crossed his arms. "You gutted a pristine Appalachian oak structure and lost it to the bank," the foreman said. His voice rumbled with undisguised contempt. "You hired cheap laborers and drove steel nails into century-old joints. I know the woman who just bought that land. She respects the wood. You only respect the mirror. I would not hire you to sweep the sawdust off my floors." The foreman pointed toward the exit. Preston walked out of the trailer, his hollow arrogance crumbling into dust. He had no skills, no network, and no future. While my family suffered the crushing consequences of their actions, I experienced the exact opposite reception. I drove my Silverado to the local lumber yard to source the heavy materials needed for my upcoming restoration. The scent of fresh pine and chopped cedar filled the expansive warehouse. I walked up to the main counter holding my written supply list. The supply manager processed my order. He tallied the total and looked up from his computer screen. He offered a slow, respectful nod. "Heard you secured the old homestead, Gwyneth," he said quietly. He handed me the printed invoice. "It is good to see that property back in capable hands. Let me know if you need the delivery truck. We will prioritize your load." I thanked him, taking the receipt. The quiet reverence from the working-class citizens of Franklin provided a profound healing balm. They did not care about designer handbags or country club galas. They respected hard work, property rights, and self-made resilience. They recognized I earned my crown, while my brother inherited a paper hat. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the foothills. My family sat on the sagging beds of their cheap motel room on the county line. The neon sign outside their window flickered, casting harsh, erratic shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The roar of the interstate echoed through the thin walls. They were trapped in a miserable purgatory, exiled from the paradise they carelessly squandered. I stood on the wraparound porch of the homestead, breathing in the crisp evening air. The property was silent and secure. The toxic voices were banished. I walked back to my truck and pulled a heavy steel crowbar from the tool chest. The social execution was finished. It was time to initiate the physical purge. I needed to tear down every tacky modern fixture my brother had installed. I needed to swing a hammer until the walls remembered who they truly belonged to. The air inside the grand parlor felt claustrophobic and stagnant. I stood in the center of the room, surveying the unnatural aesthetic my brother had forced upon the estate. Preston had commanded his discount labor crews to cover the magnificent timber skeleton of our ancestral home with cheap, imported drywall. He envisioned a minimalist modern retreat devoid of history. He ordered the installation of harsh, recessed track fixtures and synthetic gray laminate flooring that clicked hollowly beneath my boots. The soul of the house was suffocating under layers of industrial plastic and rushed, greedy decisions. I tightened the straps of my leather work gloves. I knelt down and unzipped my canvas tool bag, retrieving a heavy 12-pound sledgehammer. The weighted steel head rested securely in my palms. The long hickory handle felt familiar and grounding. For 30 years, I had tiptoed around the fragile egos of my family, terrified of breaking their unwritten rules. Today, I was the architect of my own environment. I planted my feet firmly onto the floorboards. I swung the sledgehammer backward, allowing the momentum to build across my shoulders. I drove the steel head forward with everything I had. The hammer struck the center of the modern drywall with a deafening, thunderous crack. The cheap gypsum board fractured instantly, spreading a spiderweb of jagged fault lines across the smooth white surface. I pulled the tool back and swung again, hitting the same weak spot. The brittle material caved inward, sending a cloud of chalky white dust billowing into the quiet room. I dropped the sledgehammer and picked up my steel crowbar. I wedged the curved iron claw into the broken gap. I leaned my body weight backward, ripping a huge, jagged section of drywall away from the framing. The synthetic material tore with a satisfying, harsh crunch. The debris crashed onto the floor. As the fake modern barrier collapsed, a revelation occurred. The stagnant air inside the parlor shifted. A clean, fragrant scent bloomed in the empty space. It was the rich, undeniable aroma of raw, ancient cedar. I stepped closer to the exposed wall, peering through the floating white dust. Behind the hasty construction shortcuts lay the original timber framing my great-great-grandfather had erected. The wood was dense, dark, and resilient. It had stood firm through blistering Tennessee summers and freezing mountain winters. Preston tried to hide this magnificent resilience behind a thin veil of fragile plaster because he only understood superficial appearances. I spent the next 3 hours locked in a fierce, tactile battle against the modern materials. It was a deeply therapeutic physical purge. Every swing of the hammer served as a visceral rejection of the toxic hierarchy that dictated my childhood. Every sheet of drywall I tore down represented the dismantling of my mother's emotional extortion. Every synthetic light fixture I ripped from the ceiling erased another pathetic trace of my brother's disastrous reign. My muscles burned with intense, familiar fatigue. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring my vision. My lungs ached from the heavy exertion, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. The labor was an exorcism. I was physically extracting the poison from the property. By mid-afternoon, the walls were stripped bare. The glorious, intricate skeleton of the estate was finally visible again. But the floor beneath my feet still offended the integrity of the room. The synthetic gray laminate Preston chose was a cheap imitation of luxury, designed to mimic real wood, but lacking any genuine character. I knelt on the ground near the grand stone fireplace. I jammed the flat edge of my chisel underneath the corner of the first laminate plank. I tapped the base of the chisel with my wooden mallet, wedging the steel deep under the interlocking seam. I pried the tool upward. The plastic plank snapped and popped free from the underlayment. I tossed the fake gray board aside and peeled back the thin foam padding beneath it. My breath caught in my throat. Resting quietly in the shadows was the original wide-plank Appalachian oak flooring. The grain was tight and mesmerizing, displaying a rich, warm amber hue that no modern factory could ever replicate. The boards were exceptionally wide, harvested from old-growth forests that no longer existed in the valley. I worked with manic-focused energy, pulling up row after row of the synthetic flooring. I hurled the cheap planks out the front door, letting them pile up like discarded trash on the porch. As the beautiful oak emerged into the daylight, I ran my bare fingertips over the smooth, worn surface. I felt the tiny, distinct grooves left behind by hand planes used over a century ago. I leaned close to inspect the joints. The floorboards were not secured with modern wire nails. They were fastened using authentic, hand-forged iron. I admired the distinct square rose-head shape of the antique fasteners. A local blacksmith had hammered each individual piece of iron by hand, ensuring the floor would never shift or warp. It was a masterclass in early American craftsmanship. It was the exact type of historic joinery I dedicated my entire professional career to preserving. I sat back on my heels, wiping the sweat and dust from my brow. The parlor was a chaotic mess of shattered drywall, discarded plastic, and torn insulation. Yet amidst the superficial destruction, the house itself felt fundamentally healed. The oppressive, sterile silence was gone. The exposed cedar and oak seemed to breathe a long overdue sigh of relief. The structure recognized the hands of a true custodian. I walked over to the heavy timber beams supporting the second floor. Preston had directed his painters to cover the majestic wood with a thick coat of gaudy, high-gloss white paint, hoping to brighten the room. The glossy chemical layer smothered the natural breathing pores of the timber. I retrieved a high heat gun and a sharp metal scraper from my tool bag. I plugged the heavy-duty cord into a nearby outlet. I held the heated nozzle an inch away from the painted beam. The intense thermal wave caused the cheap latex to bubble and blister. I pressed the edge of the scraper against the wood and pushed forward. The toxic white skin peeled away in long, satisfying, curled strips. Underneath the paint, the dark heartwood emerged unharmed. I saw the distinct scalloped indentations left by a broadaxe. Those marks told a profound, silent story. They recorded the exact rhythm and strength of the man who carved the beam from a raw, felled tree. My ancestors did not take shortcuts. They built their legacy with calloused hands and unwavering patience. My parents had forgotten that sacred lesson, choosing to worship the illusion of status instead of the dignity of honest labor. The physical exertion grounded my racing thoughts. The rhythmic scraping motion provided a moving meditation. I was no longer the discarded spare daughter waiting for a scrap of validation. I was a historic timber restorer, utilizing my true expertise to save a masterpiece. I was the rightful heir, claiming my inheritance not through a rigged legal document, but through sweat, respect, and devotion. The sun began its slow descent, casting a warm, golden light through the uncovered window panes. The rays illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into tiny, floating sparks of gold. The exposed Appalachian oak floors glowed with a fiery amber brilliance. The cedar walls radiated a deep, comforting warmth. The house was no longer a gutted ruin. It was a majestic survivor, standing tall and proud, despite the temporary indignities it endured. I turned off the heat gun and set my scraper down. My hands were blistered and my back ached, but a profound sense of peace settled over my mind. The superficial layers of my brother's failure were eradicated. The environment was physically purged of his toxic influence. However, a nagging realization crept into my thoughts as I surveyed the beautiful exposed timber. Physical restoration was only half the battle. Wood and iron could withstand the test of time, but they offered no defense against the treacherous schemes of desperate people. My parents were exiled to a cheap motel, but they were not dead. They were proud, vindictive individuals who would inevitably seek revenge. They would scour the state laws looking for loopholes, attempting to challenge the auction or dispute the corporate transfer. They would not accept their defeat without launching a final, desperate legal war. A sturdy roof and a solid foundation were meaningless if the framework supporting them remained vulnerable. I needed to build a fortress that no lawyer, no relative, and no amount of Southern guilt could ever penetrate. I had to lock the gate and throw away the key forever. I picked up my phone from the dusty windowsill and scrolled to the contact list. I pressed the icon next to Attorney Davis' name. I listened to the dial tone ring out into the quiet twilight. The physical labor was finished. It was time to legally secure the legacy. The phone rang twice before Davis answered the call. I explained my directive without hesitation. I wanted a fortress. Heritage Preservation LLC served its purpose as a temporary shield for the courthouse auction. Now I needed a permanent vault. I instructed the attorney to draft an irrevocable trust. In the state of Tennessee, this specific legal instrument creates an impenetrable barrier against civil litigation. Once the property transfers into the trust, it legally ceases to belong to the individual. It becomes an independent entity governed by strict, unyielding rules. My parents could hire a legion of desperate litigators. They could attempt to sue me for emotional distress or claim some fabricated breach of familial duty. A judge would throw the lawsuit out before the preliminary hearing. The trust shielded the homestead from any future claims, hostile maneuvers, or inherited debts. The next morning, I drove back to the Glass Tower in Nashville. The air inside the conference room smelled of rich leather and polished cedar. Davis slid a thick stack of documents across the mahogany table. I picked up the heavy brass pen resting beside the paper. For 30 years, I signed my name on the dotted line of other people's projects. I signed invoices for lumber. I signed liability waivers for contractors. I always operated in the margins of the Lawrence dynasty. The Golden Sun took up all the available space. I pressed the metal nib against the crisp paper. I formed the letters of my own name. The dark ink settled deep into the fibers. The internal knot of anxiety, the persistent nagging fear that I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop, finally unraveled. The ghost of the spare daughter vanished. I was the sole architect of my future. I handed the folder back to the attorney. We shook hands across the desk. The legal trap was permanently sealed. 6 months passed. The brutal winter thawed into a rainy spring, washing away the deep, muddy ruts my family left on the front lawn. Summer arrived, baking the Appalachian foothills in a warm, golden heat. The seasons marched forward, indifferent to the social execution of my abusers. The reality of their new existence settled into a grim, relentless routine. Preston did not discover a sudden influx of brilliant venture capitalists. He secured a position at a chain hardware store 2 counties away, where the local residents did not recognize his face. The golden boy who scoffed at my manual labor now wore a stiff red polyester apron. He spent his 8-hour shifts walking the fluorescent-lit aisles, organizing cardboard boxes of cheap zinc screws and sweeping chemical dust from the cold concrete floor. He earned a minimum wage paycheck that barely covered his basic living expenses. Local contractors occasionally walked into the store, purchasing the exact same synthetic materials Preston had used to butcher our historic estate. They spoke down to him, treating him like an invisible servant. He returned every night to a sterile, rented studio apartment, nursing his shattered ego in total isolation. He possessed no wife, no fortune, and no future. Richard and Diane suffered a parallel fate. They secured a cramped two-bedroom apartment situated adjacent to a noisy interstate highway. Their new reality lacked the sweeping vistas and quiet dignity of the historic valley. The thin drywall offered zero insulation against the constant roar of commuter traffic and the loud arguments of the neighbors living next door. The tiny kitchen lacked the necessary cabinet space to hold the delicate porcelain fine china Diane had meticulously packed during the eviction. The expensive plates sat stacked in brown cardboard boxes pushed into a dark corner of the living room, collecting dust. Diane no longer hosted elite charity galas on manicured terraces. She sat on a discounted fabric sofa, staring at a small, flickering television screen. Her designer clothing hung in a tiny particle board closet, smelling of stale cooking oil, drifting through the shared ventilation shafts. Richard aged a decade in 6 months. His broad shoulders slumped forward. His former peers turned their heads and walked down different aisles when they crossed paths at the local grocery store. Their delusions of grandeur fractured under the crushing, relentless grind of utility bills and overdue rent notices. They were ordinary, discarded, and forgotten. Back at the homestead, the transformation was breathtaking. I spent the spring months utilizing every ounce of my professional expertise. I repaired the damaged timber framing using authentic joinery techniques. I secured the heavy antique beams with hand-forged iron nails. I sanded the wide plank oak floors until the grain flowed like a river of warm amber. I applied the warm linseed oil by hand using soft cotton rags. I rubbed the golden liquid deep into the pores of the timber. The oil nourished the thirsty wood, bringing out a radiant, fiery glow across the living room. The rich, earthy fragrance permeated every room, replacing the foul stench of cheap synthetic materials and lingering despair. The house radiated a deep, quiet strength. It stood as a towering monument to resilience. The foundation was secure. The roof was flawless. I stood on the wraparound porch early one Sunday morning. The air felt crisp and clean. The rising sun illuminated the dew clinging to the wild hydrangeas I replanted near the stairs. I wore my familiar canvas work pants and a faded flannel shirt. I knelt down and picked up a heavy piece of custom-carved oak I had shaped the previous evening. The wood felt solid and warm against my calloused palms. I carved the letters myself late one night using my sharpest steel chisels and a wooden mallet. I followed the natural grain of the wood, allowing the unique character of the oak to dictate the flow of the script. I burned the edges of the carved letters using a high-heat iron, darkening the script until it stood out bold and undeniable against the amber wood. I walked down the long gravel driveway. The stones crunched under my boots, providing a steady, rhythmic soundtrack to my journey. I reached the wrought iron gates standing at the edge of the rural highway. This was the exact spot where Preston previously mounted his flashy neon corporate banner. That cheap metal sign was long gone, discarded in a dumpster along with his empty promises. I held the new oak fixture against the stone pillar. I retrieved my cordless drill and drove the heavy steel mounting brackets into the masonry. The fixture held firm, unyielding against the morning breeze. I stepped back to admire the craftsmanship. I did not carve a patriarchal title into the wood. There was no mention of a dynasty, an estate, or a golden sun. The sign bore a single word burned deeply into the rich grain: Lawrence. It was my name. I reclaimed it from the people who tried to render it worthless. I turned around and looked back up the winding driveway toward the majestic timber frame home. The story ended without a screaming match. It concluded without tears or dramatic courtroom outbursts. It ended with the profound, unshakable quiet of a woman who bought her own peace. The timber frame home stands as a profound metaphor for the human soul. When rot takes hold deep within the foundation, no amount of fresh paint or imported drywall can save the structure from eventual collapse. I write this reflection not merely as an observer of a family's tragic unraveling, but through the lens of a spiritual cultivator, one who looks beyond the superficial noise of society to examine the quiet, fundamental truths of human nature. In the devastating saga of the Lawrence family, we witness a catastrophe that mirrors a silent epidemic spreading through the traditional American family structure. We see a legacy reduced to ash, not by financial misfortune, but by a catastrophic deficit of moral clarity. The destruction of this historic estate serves as a spiritual mirror, reflecting the stark reality of how we raise our children, how we distribute our affection, and what inevitably happens when ego replaces emotional awareness. To the parents across America, those who are building their empires and fiercely protecting their bloodlines, the fall of Richard and Diane Lawrence must serve as a jarring spiritual wake-up call. We frequently confuse the transfer of material wealth with the imparting of a true legacy. In our endless pursuit of prestige and societal validation, we risk creating idols out of our children. We designate a favored heir to carry our worldly ambitions, wrapping them in a protective bubble of unearned privilege. Yet when we elevate one child to the status of a deity, while marginalizing another as a mere spare, we are not practicing love. We are practicing spiritual corruption. True family education requires an unwavering commitment to fairness, honesty, and deep emotional intelligence. When parents blind themselves to a child's profound flaws, coddling their entitlement and shielding them from the natural consequences of their actions, they are not offering protection. They strip the child of the very friction required to build a functional moral compass. A parent's highest responsibility is not to hand a child the keys to a kingdom they did not earn, but to guide them in the rigorous cultivation of their own inner character. If you do not possess the wisdom to see your children clearly, free from the intoxicating, distorting lens of your own ego, you will ultimately watch them burn your legacy to the ground. You cannot build a resilient family without first cultivating a resilient, honest self. For the young adults standing in the cold shadows of someone else's unearned spotlight, Gwyneth's journey offers a transformative blueprint for survival and self-mastery. Rejection is rarely a curse. More often, it is the universe's most potent catalyst for developing true inner resilience. When your family or society overlooks you, they inadvertently gift you the quiet, uninterrupted space necessary to cultivate your authentic self. Gwyneth did not wait for validation to fall from the sky, nor did she waste her precious energy begging for a seat at a table built on illusions. She honed her craft. She embraced the quiet, unglamorous dignity of honest labor, allowing the daily friction of hardship to sharpen her mind and temper her spirit. To the youth navigating this demanding modern culture, do not measure your worth by the inheritance you are denied or the titles you are refused. Your value is forged in the calluses on your hands, the quiet discipline of your mind, and the unshakable morality of your choices. True wealth is the inner fortitude that remains standing when the bank accounts are frozen, the luxury cars are repossessed, and the superficial applause of the world fades into silence. Master yourself. Refine your intellect, your work ethic, and your integrity. When you cultivate an unbreakable spirit, you will never be at the mercy of those who seek to diminish your light. In the broader context of traditional American culture, we place a heavy emphasis on the aesthetic of the family unit. We idolize the sprawling green lawns, the perfect holiday dinners, and the meticulously curated social image broadcast to the neighborhood. But an aesthetic is a fragile, hollow thing. When a family's foundation relies on appearances rather than emotional awareness and mutual respect, it becomes a house of cards, waiting for a strong wind. Real tradition is not the preservation of antique china or the passing down of a prominent surname. It is the generational transmission of resilience, integrity, and grace. Achieving this requires parents to engage in constant, grueling self-reflection. We must mend the fractures within our own spirits before we attempt to mold the spirits of the next generation. If we raise children with a toxic metric of conditional love, tying their human value solely to their worldly success or their compliance with our demands, we breed hollow adults terrified of their own inadequacy. A healthy, enduring family structure demands the courage to enforce firm boundaries, the humility to admit error, and the profound wisdom to love a child enough to let them fail. It requires a daily conscious effort to turn away from the superficial demands of society and focus on the spiritual nourishment of the home. These are the hard, jagged truths we often refuse to acknowledge until the wreckage is already piled high on the front lawn. If this reflection resonates with the silent battles you are fighting within your own walls, if you find yourself questioning the foundations of your own legacy, I invite you to subscribe to Mourning Revenge. Join our community as we continue to explore the intricate, often painful dynamics of human nature, unearthing the vital lessons hidden in the ashes of broken legacies. We are deeply conditioned by society to believe that family is our ultimate safe harbor, the singular, guaranteed destination where we are unconditionally owed love, loyalty, and protection. But perhaps this is our most dangerous cultural illusion. Family is not a sanctuary. It is a spiritual crucible. It is the intense, unforgiving fire designed to burn away our dependencies, strip us of our vanity, and expose the raw, unvarnished truth of who we are. Sometimes the people who share our blood are not meant to be our lifelong companions or our ultimate protectors. Sometimes their highest cosmic purpose is to betray us, to discard us, and to push us so mercilessly to the edge of the abyss that we are finally forced to discover our own wings. Healing does not always look like a reconciled family sitting happily around a Thanksgiving table, holding hands and ignoring the past. More often than not, true healing looks like a locked door, an empty room, and the breathtaking realization that you are entirely, beautifully alone, and finally whole.